The term plague has struck fear into the heart of even the strongest and bravest of warriors. This unstoppable manifestation of death has swept through Europe multiple times throughout history and caused the death of millions. But in Scotland, the outcome of these horrific pandemics have always been a little odd. In 664 AD, there was the plague of Justinian, which originated from Rome-occupied Egypt and made its way through Constantinople and into Europe. For 20 years it ravaged the land. In England, Ireland and Wales, millions would die. But for reasons unknown, the plague never reached Scotland. Some were heard to say that Scotland had been spared the pestilence due to the powers and piety of St. Columba, apostle of the Picts. Many years later, in 1346, the Great Pandemic occurred in Europe. A plague known far and wide as the Black Death swept the land. Over 200 million people died, and the population of Europe dropped by 60%. Yet as the terror of the Black Death infiltrated the minds of many, the Scottish had a very different outlook. You see, at this time, Scotland had recently regained its freedom and independence from England. But as a country that had suffered years of war, constantly outnumbered, we were unsure just how long our new freedom would last. The English were rallying forces once more. They were determined to kill all those opposed to the Southern Crown. This culminated in the Battle of Neville Cross, where King David II of Scotland was defeated and captured by the English forces. The newly freed country was at a loss, but just then, the enemies of Scotland began to die in their thousands. It would seem to many Scots that the capture of the king had spurred God into action, and those who had hunted and slaughtered our people for hundreds of years now faced the judgment and the wrath of the Almighty. Once more, Scotland seemed to be completely unaffected by the plague. The Scottish Church at the time claimed it to be the divine favour of St. Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland. Others claimed the plague never arrived in Scotland due to the diligent work of those on the border. And that is the subject of our tale: how the plague was buried. Many years ago, in a wild part of Teviotdale on the Scottish border, there stood a small cottage, home to a shepherd and his wife. As the years went on, the pair had 2 children, and were very content with their quiet life on the moorland. The small family was very isolated. Their neighbours were many miles away, and it was unheard of for any stranger from the south to navigate the treacherous peat bogs. So you can imagine the great novelty when one did. It was on a fair afternoon, late in the year. The moor was cloaked in a blanket of purple heather, and the housewife was busy with her daily work. As the young children played in the fields, they heard the sudden barking of the 2 dogs, who until a minute ago had been fast asleep by the cottage entrance. As the bairns scanned the horizon, they caught sight of an odd figure in the distance. Filled with excitement, the pair rushed to tell their mother. The bairns pulled the woman out of the cottage and pointed at the figure. Now he was a little closer. The mother could see the jolly-faced old man heading towards the house with a large bag upon his back. He greeted the woman with a strong English accent and told her he was a peddler, here to sell his wares. The cheerful figure betrayed no hint of the true horror he had brought to the land. There was much joy and excitement as the kind old man displayed his wide assortment of trinkets. The woman had never met a trader before, and was overjoyed to purchase items for the whole family. She chose a small knife for her husband, and bought a toy for each of the children. "And what for yourself?" inquired the peddler, "for you are too beautiful to have nothing." At this the woman blushed, as the man produced a fine collar, and told the woman that all the noble ladies in London wear such items, but she was not interested. The man paused as if deep in thought, and suddenly his face beamed with excitement. "I have the very item for you," he said, producing a cap with red ribbons. The man expertly placed the cap on the woman's head. "Perfect. The cherry ribbons match your fair cheeks, ma'am." The man continued, telling the woman that with such a fine cap, she looked like the wife of a laird. The hint of hesitation on the wife's face caused the man to continue his efforts. "That cap is a bargain indeed," called the man. "It has only been wore by one before you, a lady of noble birth, but her face did not have your healthy colour, and so the cap made her look pale and thin." Through flattery and the craft of his trade, the peddler sealed the deal and left the cottage, well paid and well fed. The woman was very pleased with her new cap, and when her husband returned home that night, he told the woman that she had never looked more beautiful. But as the family slept that night, an insidious evil was present within their home. On the next morning, the shepherd woke early and headed to the fields. A short time later, his wife and children rose. But that morning, the woman felt incredibly ill. She had a burning fever and was held by an intense sickness. The poor woman could not move to escape her bed, and had not the strength to call for help. Unfortunately for the family, the previous owner of the cap had succumbed to the Black Death and tainted the red ribbons with a potent toxin. Throughout the day, the children would also succumb to the great pestilence. And that night, the shepherd returned to find his loved ones in great pain. Spurred into a great panic, the man ran to seek help. Hours later, a white-faced and wild-eyed man banged heavily upon the door of another cottage. Gasping for breath, the shepherd told his tale and begged for help. With all haste, the farmer who lived in the cottage woke his sons and sent them to gather the people of the area, while he attempted to restrain and console the terrified man. Soon the shepherd was surrounded by a group of local farmers. Each of the work-wearied men had fear in their eyes, but to the horror of the frantic man, he could see no pity. There was an air of anger and purpose, as if the men had gathered to repel a band of raiders from the south. It was soon decided that the invisible enemy, which had arrived in their lonely part of Scotland, would have to be destroyed. For the sake of many, one family would be sacrificed. The plague must be buried. The farmers rode down the glens and over the moors to the shepherd's cottage, completely ignoring the man's desperate pleas to spare his family and halt their actions. The cottage door was nailed shut, with very little resistance from within. The men then took spades and began to dig. Each shovelful of dirt was thrown against the small cottage. It was obvious to the inhabitants and the distraught shepherd the men meant to bury them alive. For a long time, this selfish and cold-hearted act took place. With each passing hour, the screams and cries of the helpless victims would tear at the men's ears, but their hearts remained unaffected. The shepherd did all he could to save his family, but was routinely removed from the worksite by the farmers. Knowing he could not save the ones he loved, the poor man collapsed and began praying to God as he listened to the cries of his family become more distant. A large turf was laid over the chimney, and the wails from within were heard no more. The shepherd was driven mad by the torture he endured that night. On the morning of the next day, the broken man finally acknowledged that his prayers were not heard, and he walked slowly out into the moors, never to be seen again. It is said that the mound still sits in Teviotdale, and beneath it a cruel plague lays imprisoned, waiting to return to a new world. Unfortunately, God could not help the shepherd or block the plague from Scotland. The miraculous events I mentioned at the start of this video were a little too good to be true. In fact, it was more likely that the isolated nature of Scotland and the density of its population played far more of a protective role than the Almighty. It is true that for many years, while England suffered from the plague, Scotland sat in relative safety. But eventually, in 1349, the Black Death did spread to Scotland. Many on the borders would become infected with this terrible disease, and much like the family in the tale, it was common to bury the contaminated alive. It is thought that many of the hills and mounds that span the border region are the sites of mass graves which date from this time. Although the plague did eventually hit Scotland, it did not stay there for very long, and the damage it did was far less severe than in many other countries. At the end of the 14th century, Scotland experienced a great age of prosperity, and the new kings of Scotland, the House of Stuart, ruled for many years. I think that the moral of this story is that even if many lives are lost, Scotland has and will continue to survive whatever the world can throw at it. Also, perhaps allowing the English to travel north in the middle of a pandemic is not a great idea. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to my wonderful patrons who really help support the videos